Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 1, Orientalist, Discourse and Colonial Modernity. First of all, introduction about the unit. In this unit, an attempt will be undertaken to understand the concept of Orientalism and the question of modernity and its colonial roots in India. This is a relatively new field that has opened up new questions and has significantly reconstituted the old field of colonial history, both for the ex-colonized societies as well as of the colonizer themselves. The history of Europe too is now increasingly marked by an awareness of the ways in which the colonial encounter crucially shaped the self image of Europe itself. In this unit, we will mainly be concerned, however, with the history of the Indian subcontinent. Although the unit will be concerned with the debate on the colonial period, it is necessary to understand that it is a field that is irrevocably constituted by the present context. In last few decades, particularly since the 1980s, this field has given rise to a whole new body of work and serious, often very sharp debates among scholars. It was during this period that an intense and fresh engagement with the whole question of our colonial modernity came to the fore. What is crucially important about this development in the scholarship on the Indian subcontinent is that it focuses, unlike earlier writings on colonial history, on the politics of knowledge implicated in that history. In a very significant way, it foregrounds the manner in which our knowledge of our own history and our own selves is framed by the understood through categories produced by colonial knowledge. Before we go into a discussion of our actual subject matter, let us make a preliminary observation. Indian history today is no longer what we have known it to be so far from our history textbooks. The new developments have illuminated aspects of that history that were hitherto covered in darkness. What do we mean when we say some aspects were covered in darkness? It is not as though some entirely new facts have been uncovered. New facts have certainly become known to us, or known facts often considered unimportant have acquired new meaning because the way we look at that history has now changed. As we will see later in the unit, the idea of history as a repository of some kind of uncontaminated truth about our past itself has become problematic in the light of these developments. Let us keep this in mind before we proceed. Now, the next point is different strands of recent scholarship. There are at least four different strands of scholarship that have come together since the 1980s that have been at the root of this transformation. The first one is the Neo-Gandhian critique. In the first place, there has been since the early 1980s the reactivation of an older Gandhian critique of modernity. Central in this trend has been the work of scholars like Ashish Nandi, Veena Das, and scholar activists active in the environment and science movements like Claude Alvarez and Vandana Shiva. Much of the critique of this set of scholars has been directed at the critique of science and rationality as the ruling ideological coordinates of modernity, along with the related notion of development followed by the Nehruvian state. Though not all scholars associated with this strand have an explicitly Gandhian orientation, they broadly extend elements of Gandhi's rejection of modern Western civilization and its faith in science and reason as the conditions of human freedom. Ashish Nandi directed his main attack on this ideological constellation of modernity, namely the constellation of science, reason, and development. He also extends that the critique to the nation state itself, which he sees as the institutional embodiment of modernity, as an institution that is always intolerant of popular beliefs and the ways of living. Nandi sees in the project of the modern nation state an inherent drive towards homogenization, towards cultural genocide, and the desire to reduce life to a few easily definable and negotiable categories. His central argument in this respect is that notions of the self in the South Asian context have been largely fluid, and it is only with the onset of the modern nation state that the attempts have been made to fix identity into singular categories like Hindus and Muslims. He points to the fact that even today, there are hundreds of communities who combine elements of both Hinduism and Islam and find it difficult to classify themselves in neat and exclusive categories. Such an argument is substantiated, for instance, by anthropological surveys by scholars like K. Suresh Singh. The next one is the subaltern studies. The second strand can be identified in the work of the Subaltern Studies School of Indian Historiography, henceforth referred to as the Subaltern historians. This school too made its first public appearance on the scene in the early 1980s, although its work began in the late 1970s. This group of historians and some political scientists came from a primarily left wing political background, and much of their initial work was a continuation of the concerns that they had developed through the impact of Maoist political practice in the 1970s. Important among scholars of this school were historian Ranjit Guha, Gyanendra Pandey, Shahid Amin, David Hardiman, and Dipesh Chakrabarti, and political scientists like Partha Chatterjee and to some extent Sudeepa Kaviraj. The common thread that links the effect of the early work of the Subaltern historian was that of scholars like Ashish Nandi was a critic of nationalism and nationalist historiography and a concern with popular consciousness. Through a series of volumes published in the 1980s, the Subaltern historians launched a major critique of nationalist historiography, which subsumed all histories into the history of the nation. By initiating this critique, they sought to recover what Ranjit Guha called the small voice of history. They sought to understand what those who participated in the nationalist or peasant struggles in the colonial period thought, why they participated, and what were the forms of their motivation and participation. In other words, they sought to recover the subjectivity and agency, the autonomy of the subaltern classes. The word subaltern is, as many of you would know, comes from the writings of the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. In the early subaltern studies, this term was used to distinguish it from other, more restrictive categories like class. Subaltern simply means the subordinate and could be used to designate different kinds of social, economic, and political subordination. As Guha puts it in his preface to the first volume of it would include subordination in South Asian society, whether it is expressed in terms of class, caste, age, gender, and office, or in any other way. The next one is the anthropological studies in the US. The third strand comes from within the field of area studied from anthropologists. Bernard Collin, largely situated in the United States. Bernard Collin works spans a much longer period starting from the mid 1950s. He had been writing on questions related to colonial knowledge of India and the ways in which this knowledge transformed the very society it claimed to study. His researches also showed how these knowledges constituted political subjectivities in the colonial world. Under his stewardship, a whole generation of scholars from the University of Chicago, like Nicholas Drake, Arjun Aparduni, and others, worked on the different modalities of colonial knowledge to show how it was thoroughly embedded in the colonial project and power. It was a knowledge that provided the intellectual justification for Britain's civilizing mission in India, where in Ranjit Guha's word, an official view of caste, a Christian missionary view of Hinduism, and an Orientalist view of Indian society as a static, timeless, spaceless, and internally undifferentiated monolith, were all products by the complicity of power and knowledge. Around the 1980s, this anthropological work gets reconfigured into a different kind of framework that explicitly situates itself within the field of our discussion. In an influential essay published in 1984, The Census, Social Structure and Objectification in South Asia, Cohen showed, for instance, how the colonial consensus not only produced knowledge about India and its people, but also produced an India that was not necessarily the India that existed prior to the advent of colonial rule. The next point is Edward Said's Orientalism. Finally, there is the work of Philistine American scholar Edward Said that could be said to have made possible the coming together of these different bodies of work, with the publication in the 1978 of Sad's highly acclaimed track Orientalism, different efforts to deal with the continuing legacy of the West in the former colonies as well as in immigrant communities in the West received a major flip. In this track, which became very influential in and around the mid 1980s, Sad showed how certain constructions of the East or the Orient have been crucial to Europe's self image. He showed through a reading of major literary texts as well as political documents, primarily speeches and such other sources, how the Orient was a peculiar European construction, backward, superstitious, barbaric, and irrational on the one hand, and the exotic and pristine on the other. Sad emphasis, however, that it should not be assumed that the structure of Orientalism is nothing more than a structure of lies or of myths. It should be understood as a body of theory and practice. This body of knowledge, he argues, undoubtedly had an older history, but in the period from the end of the 18th century, there emerged a complex Orient suitable for study in the academy, for display in the museum, for reconstruction in the colonial office, for theoretical illustration in anthropological, historical, biological, linguistic, racial, and historical theses about mankind and the universe, for instances of sociological theories of development, revolution, cultural, personality, national, or religious character. It can easily be seen that all the strands of scholarship mentioned above had already begun in different ways to challenge the very frameworks of knowledge that had dominated our understandings of our history. With the exception of early subaltern studies school, all the other had explicitly begun asking fundamental questions about Western knowledge, especially colonial knowledge itself. Even in the case of subaltern historian, their relentless interrogations of nationalist and the elitist history writings and the quest for subaltern autonomy led by them eventually to question some of the very crucial ways in which nationalism itself was structured by Western knowledge. It should also be mentioned at this stage that these different and diverse strengths could come together because of another intellectual development in Europe and the United States. This was what is loosely called the post structuralist current, or what is often loosely termed postmodernism, which launched a vigorous internal critique of the entire tradition of Western philosophy and metaphysics since the Enlightenment. However, that is not our immediate concern here, and we shall return to some of its more relevant aspects later. Let us now examine the main contentions of colonial discourse theory in our next lecture. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.